All right. And right after company, we want to go with my colors. And this is going to be the case where, again, we have the buttons, but we'll pass data a bit differently. So we're not going to use text content in order to access that data. We'll use data set property. Now, the way the data set property works, if you take a look at the complete project, and that's not what I'm looking for. Let me see. So I have my colors, and I would want to access it over here. Notice, so we will have the button. The name will be color. And then for the data, there's going to be a data hyphen color. So on the HTML element, we can add the attribute. So the name needs to start with data, and then whatever you would want. In this case, of course, it's going to be color. And then, of course, I'll set up my value, whatever it is. And then for the background color, the same like we did in the single product, we'll also just add this style background color. Now, in order to access this, we'll have to use dot data set. So I'm just giving you a heads up how we're going to pass in the data. Of course, we'll set this up together, and I'll probably repeat the same steps one more time. So let's first start by iterating, of course, over our colors, correct? So I'm going to navigate to filters component, and then in here, right after the end of companies, let's say colors, and we'll select this one and add end off colors. And then once we have these two comments, then of course, let's set up our form control. And then inside of this form control, the div, I'm going to go with heading 5 and colors over here. And now we want to set up a div with a class of colors. And we'll start by iterating over our colors array. And then for every color, I would want to display the button. But there's going to be a gotcha because for the color of all, notice here we have also a button that has the content of all. There's going to be a different return. But first, let's just iterate over and we'll see the problems. So I'll start here by saying colors and then map. So as I'm mapping over, I would want to access, of course, my color. And again, just to make this shorter, I'm just going to say C and then index. And then eventually there's going to be a condition that checks for the color of all, but not right now. We'll just say that for every color that I have, I'm going to return a button over here. And then, of course, as far as the value, I would want to display the color, but in this case, I'll have to check whether it is actually the main color instead. And notice here, we'll also display that checkbox. So that's something that we'll have to do a little bit later. So there's going to be a button. Yeah, that's beautiful. But for now, I'm not going to place anything inside. I'm just going to worry about the attributes. So start with a key. That will be equal to the index. Then the name, since, of course, I'll use that later in my update filters function, correct? And this one needs to match the state value. That's why it's going to be color. Then, just like in the single product, by default, they'll have one color. And again, if you want to scroll down, notice we have colors and then color button. And by default, they will have this black color. And then dynamically, we'll add that color using inline CSS. Since I know that colors is an array with hex values, and that hex value is sitting right over here. So just like in a single product, I'm going to go with style attribute and we'll dynamically add the background property. So background, and that one will be equal to my color. Then I also would want to add a class name if the button is actually active. So if it matches my state value. So we're going to go here with class name. Again, the same thing. We're setting up, of course, our expression over here. And let's just say if the color state value matches to the one of the individual color, then of course I would want to add a class of color button and active. If not, then just a color button. So let's go here with color hyphen btn and then active class, if that is the case. If not, then let's just add a color button class. And then, of course, I would want to add that value, that hex value, to the data, because I would want to somehow pass from the button to my filter context. Remember, we were using this event object, and when it comes to buttons, well, we couldn't just use the value. That wouldn't work. So in here, I'll use this data attribute that comes with HTML. We just need to come up with a name. So in my case, I'm just going to say data hyphen and then color, but you can name this puppy. It doesn't really matter as long as you start with data hyphen and then whatever name you would want. And I'll set this equal dynamically to my color value. And then, of course, once I click, I would want to run my update filters. So that's why I'll add on click, and that one will be equal to my update filters. And then finally, inside of this button, like I said, I would want to use my FA check icon to showcase, well, which color is the current state value. So inside of the button, we'll say if the state value matches my current button, then I would want to display the FA check over here. So that's my component. If it's not a case, then let's just go with no. So we will save it, and we do have the colors. So that kind of works, right? But then once you press on a color, of course, our functionality goes bananas. Why? Well, because we are not setting up the value correctly. And we can clearly see that, again, if we navigate to the state, we have the components, we have the reducer and all of that. And by default, color is all. And then once you press, of course, now, again, it is just going to be an empty string. And that's not something that we're looking for. And in order to get this data color, again, we'll have to navigate back to the filter context and set up one more if statement. Because again, I don't want to change this functionality. I don't want to change the functionality in filter reducer. I simply want to make sure that if the name value is equal to a color, well, then I'm just going to access that value a little bit differently, since I know that it is a button that has that data set property. So I'll say here, if the name is equal to a color, then please set the value equal to event target. So that gets me that button element. And then, like I said, if you want to access that data attribute, you just need to go to data set, and then color. Now there's a method that you can use also, get attribute, and then just pass in the name. But I always prefer using this data set instead. So now we should be nicely changing those values. So by default, we'll get this one. And then notice as I'm changing, of course, I get the value. Now, check out the first one. Technically, this is that default one. And why this is the default one? Because this is that value of all. And what I would want instead is to nicely display the button that says all. And that's why we'll have to navigate back to my filters. And inside of the filters, when we're iterating over, if the value for the color will be all, then there's going to be a different return. So this is going to be for rest of the buttons, but before that, we'll set up if the value of color is equal to all. Well, then I would want to set up a different return. So say in here, button. So I'm still returning a button. Now, I don't need really a key, so that doesn't really matter. Name still needs to be a color. Now on click still needs to invoke the update filters. So a lot of things will stay exactly the same. Now data and then all, or I'm sorry, data color needs to be all, since that is the all button. And then of course, I also need to have a class name if it is a active button. But in here, I'm not going to check the value here, like I did with color equals to my color button. No. And here I'm just saying that by default, it's going to be all. Now I do want to add a different class if it is the state value. So let's go with class name. And then we're going to go with our template string. And then instead of this template string, let's go with if the color is equal to all, then I would want to add two classes, all -btn and the active one. If it's not the case, then I'm just going to go with all -btn. We'll save this one and we should get the button with value of all. And then notice as we're clicking, then of course we're changing the value. And if we would want to double check that, let's just go to our application, to the components. As always, we go to reducer and then nicely notice we have filters, we have text company and all that, but we're looking for this color. And then at the moment, it should be all. And then once we click, check it out. Now, of course, the value is that hex value that we're getting from our array. And as I'm clicking, notice I'm changing the active button and I'm also changing the state value. Again, if you need to double check whether the reducer runs properly, just go to filter reducer, since that's going to be important later on. And just make sure that once you click on a button, you notice here that we're getting the unique value. Now in here it says each child in list must have unique key prop. So you know what? I'm gonna go back to the filters and I'm just gonna say if it is all, then I'll use the same index. So say key is equal to my index, like so. So let's set this up. That should do it. And then every time we click on a button, notice we're filtering product. So our functionality works. And now we can display our next filter.